Greetings everyone, this is Ahav Ever from the Chronicles of Ahav Ever, and today's video is going to be about did Torath Mosheh Israelis/Jews come from the Canaanites? Now I've done a few videos that kind of touch on this topic in one form or the other, but most of them deal with in terms of whether Torath Mosheh, whether the language itself, that are used by Jews, came from the Canaanites in one form or the other. But I would suggest that you go look at these videos that you see here in my video list to give you kind of a reference to what's being talked about in this video right now. So as always, a lot of my videos lately have been coming from claims that have been made in one form or the other. And one of the claims I see from some situations, mainly from people who are not scholars themselves, and again, I've read some of the scholarly suggestions in this area, but one of the things that's been made is a claim has been made that Israelites, using the word that they use, came from the Canaanites. Now in this video, what I'm going to be dealing with is exactly what exactly do these terms mean, and what would it mean for a supposed Israelite to have come from the Canaanites? And I'm going to also show that sometimes when people use the word Israelite, they're almost in a sense separating the Jewish people from the people that they're talking about. So meaning modern day Jews, in some level, it's like people are trying to say that modern day Jews are not from the ancestry that we claim, but we'll get to that in a little bit. So historically speaking, what to expect from this video? The first thing is, when dealing with this issue, I would expect to, for example, to see a Canaanite written source defining what exactly is a Canaanite. Next, I would expect a Canaanite written source claiming that a people called Yisroel were originally Canaanite. Next, I would also say a clear ancient source which claims that a people called Yisroel were present at the origins of the Canaanite society, the origins of it. And then lastly, an unquestionable understanding of what is meant anciently to be a Canaanite and what is meant to be Yisrael. Now, what do I mean by this, linguistically speaking? What you see is the following. You know, on one side, this side on the left, you see the various ancient terms or ancient writing systems of different societies, be it the first one, the top one being an Egyptian society, the second one being a Moabite society, and then the next two being, the last bottom two, the second to last one being a Jewish writing, and then the last one being a Samaritan writing. And all of these particular writing systems are saying one word, and that's Yisroel, or as the Samaritans pronounce it, Yishrael. So on the left side, you have what leads to be the Canaanim or Canaanites in English, for example. Well, Canaan is the way it was actually pronounced in ancient times. The top script being a Ugaritic script or Sumerian script, and then the second one being a Jewish script of how we wrote the name Canaani. So what we would expect, and the question we're going to be addressing, is whether or not one can claim, historically speaking, the Canaanim were the source of a group of people named Yisroel. So the first question that would come up if we're dealing with a historical, archaeological setting would be, where did the Canaanites define who is a Canaanite in the first place? When we look through their text, where exactly do they say a Canaanite is this? Do they say, for example, a Canaanite is anyone living in a Canaani land? Do they say that a Canaanite, Canaani, is someone who was at the start of the Canaani culture? Do we say that a Canaani is anyone who has an ID card, or ID tablet that says that I'm, a Canaani? What exactly did the Canaanim, where did they define in their own writings what exactly a Canaani person is? And then we would also look externally during the same time period. What do the Egyptians, the people from Kemet or Mitzrayim, as we say in Hebrew, what do they say? Who do they define as a Canaanite? The Ashurim, the Assyrians, what do they say as a Canaanite? Even, let's say the Chinese, the Greeks, anyone. Who do they say a Canaanite is? This is the way that we would have to analyze this. Now, in terms of what do modern Western scholars say, well, there's a couple of things they say. They sometimes use the term Sumerian, Ugaritic. They also use the word Canaanite actually in English, Proto-Semitic, and Old Canaanite, and sometimes Hebrew when dealing with the language, the culture. And the question would be, well, wait a minute, how can you have all these different terms that sound completely different and say different things be used to describe one group of people? Let's just call them who they were. And the main reason all these terms modernly exist is because The Canaanites are out of the office. They don't exist anymore. There is no group of people today who can substantially say that they're a Canaanite or a Canaanite and show you that they know the Canaanite language, that they practice the Canaanite culture from several thousand years ago, that they do writings still in the Canaanite format in the scripts that you see. Those people don't exist. At the most, right now, you have some people who are, part of the Palestinians who claim that they're a Canaanite descent. But there's actually a really good video that I don't have posted here, but where this guy went over there and started asking them, okay, are you descendants of Canaanites? And if so, what were the name of the kings? What was the language? What was this and that? And people didn't have answers for anything that he was asking because it's not a part of their culture. Now, dealing with this issue of what exactly is a Canaanite and what do modern scholars say and why they have to say it the way they do, this article here from Brendan University does a real good job as a starting point because it says that there are controversial questions concerning who was a Canaanite and what a Canaanite religion is. And if you look at the highlighted parts, basically what he talks about is that when you look at historians, there's a controversial issue in terms of trying to identify exactly who the Canaanim or the Canaanites actually were. And there's a lot of questions concerning who is a Canaanite and what is a Canaanite religion, and he explains why. For example, he says the concept of a Canaanite religion is a difficult one, since it is very likely that the ancient peoples we call Canaanite were not even aware that they were religious. The modern English word religion has no equivalent in ancient Canaanite languages, and an etymological discussion of its roots will not profit this discussion. Lastly, he says here that I've highlighted, all such definitions would have been regarded as irrelevant by an ancient people whose lives evolved in integration of worldview, ethos, and the struggles for existence in an environment indifferent to their presence. So what essentially this means is that the idea of a religion, is a modern thing. It's kind of a modern word, and it didn't exist as a word in those times. For example, it'd be like someone, thinking that, okay, I'm going to take my modern concept and apply it to someone several thousand years ago who wouldn't have sat down and said, well, I'm a part of this religion. Their ideas would have just simply been connected to the lifestyle they were living and the way that they lived it. It wouldn't have had a real definition for the most part. And even in, amongst us Jews, in the Torah itself, there's no real word that is religion. There's no definition of religion. There are concepts that come from the creator of all things. And there are concepts that are made up by people that don't, have any real value to them. And that's about it. There's no real concept of, this religion and that religion sit down together. There's, something that's truth and something that's not truth, period. So as we can see, already that there's a controversial issue in terms of trying to identify who Canaanite even was to begin with. So the next thing I looked at is an article concerning the Canaanite language itself. And one of the first things it mentions is because most of the Canaanite languages are tested for only a brief period of time and only a handful of text, it is hard to detect diachronic and dialectal variation. And what this means is that if you were to try to identify the languages themselves and by like token try to identify the people, that's very difficult because the amount of text only covers a small period of time to where you can't overall say the Canaanites, language was this, because you would need a longer period of time to go from the start to finish, for example. Next, another thing that I highlighted was although the place of Canaanite within the Semitic family is well established, the integral subgrouping of the Canaanite language remains murky due to two factors. First, most of the Canaanite languages are poorly attested. And going further, this is making it difficult to know when there's morphosemantic innovations are shared amongst languages. What this would mean is that you don't have, for example, a very clear picture, with enough information to explain the Canaanite language. As an example, let's say you find, let's say 1,000, for example, stones that have Canaanite, information written on it. Well, one of the first problems you run into is, okay, well, where's the dictionary? Where's the instruction on grammar? Where do you get that information from? The Canaanites didn't leave behind dictionaries. They didn't leave behind books on their grammar. So all you have is just these carvings, markings, maybe papyrus, maybe scrolls that have information on it, but it's not information that's well attested in terms of exactly what does this mean to a Canaanite. It'd be like if you had, for example, a Canaanite scholar who sat down and explained their language from start to finish, then you may have something there. Okay, going further, it says second, most of the Canaanite languages are recorded in a purely consonantal script, which makes it difficult to detect morphosemantic changes that affected only vowels. What this means is that similar to ancient Hebrew, similar to Proto-Phoenician, similar to a number of languages in the region like Moabite, The written text itself did not have a vowel system that was displayed in the text. There's only like about 2 letters that every once in a while give the indication of a potential vowel there, but it's not always the case. And all the other vowels, were not present. So for example, the ability to have a u, a, e, e, is not really, o is not really attested in, ancient Canaanite. And again, there's no Canaanite dictionaries that exist from the time period of Canaanites explaining exactly how their language works from start to finish. Back during that time, if written script only had consonants and no vowels, you would have a hard time even explaining to someone who didn't know the language already, an outsider, how to even pronounce the language. And pronunciation is a major key in understanding what something means, because you could easily have one word that has 2 different pronunciations depending on what vowels are present, and it could be 2 different things, and you could easily have a situation where it's written in 2 different scenarios, means 2 different things, but there's no way to identify both of those. Further to that, Live Science, their website, has an interesting article about who were the Canaanites, and they mention much of what scholars know about the Canaanites comes from records left by the people they came into contact with. Further, scholars doubt that the Canaanites were even politically united into a single kingdom. In fact, archaeological excavations indicate that the Canaanites were actually made up of different ethnic groups. And then lastly, the letters that show that Egypt held considerable power over these Canaanite kings. And this is going into the last part of that side on the right. It says one letter written by a king of Babylon named Burebirias complains about the killing of a Babylonian merchant in Canaan, or Canaan, and reminds Egypt's pharaoh, the land of Canaan, is your land, and its kings are your servants. Now, this provides an interesting bit of information here. If one wants to, identify the Canaanites and say, well, for example, the Yisraelim, or if you will, the Israelites, were somehow a Canaanite people, well, basically everything I've been showing so far says that it's not clear who a Canaanite even was to begin with. Further to that point, this last part of the article, this article is interesting, where if a Babylonian king from several thousand years ago was complaining to the Egyptians that the Canaanites are basically is your land, and its kings are your servants, then you could also say, well, the Canaanites were actually an Egyptian people because of the fact that Egypt, ruled over. And there is historical information about a time when Egypt ruled over, the area that, was known as Canaan, which again depends on, getting through these murky areas of who a Canaanite is, is kind of difficult for someone to say, the Israelites were Canaanites when you can't even identify who a Canaanite is to begin with. And then also, there's another article from encyclopedia.com. The second source for knowing Canaanite religion was those classical texts that preserve descriptions of aspects of it. Then it says the reliability of which they describe that one of the texts is the Phoenician history of Philobiblios. And it says the reliability of Philobiblios, however, has been the subject of scholarly debate. And the present consensus is that the comparability of the Phoenician history with authentic Canaanite data should not be overstressed. So I'm going to present one of the problems, besides the fact that the Canaanites no longer exist and haven't existed for several thousand years, as being an issue in terms of trying to identify them, and also trying to connect them directly as Israelites being a Canaanite people coming from the Canaanites. One of the things you have in the area is cultural overlap. Meaning that at one point you have one culture that dominates another culture, and even if that culture was somewhat independent, the culture that dominates them becomes the culture that runs the show and tells them what to do, and basically becomes the rulers of the land, if you so to speak. And if you look at certain maps, we see that at one point the Egyptian government dominated parts of Canaan or Canaan, and essentially that would have made those areas Egyptian. Rather than specifically Canaanite, just been maybe a vassal state. And then you also have the issue that eventually, the people of Israel, our ancestors, came in, and basically also took over and, became the rulers of the land, so on and so on, and back and forth. So trying to, and one of the difficulties with archaeology, for example, let's say you find, something that was written in Canaani, and you try to identify it as Canaani. Well, again, the problem is, how do I know that this is Canaani? Does it have oh, I am a Canaanite written on it? Or this is the property of the Canaanites, copyright Canaanite, blah, blah, blah. That's one issue. But let's say you find something that's from let's say 3,400 years ago. And in terms of trying to date it for karma dating, usually there's a percentage of error that's involved that could be almost to 100 to 200 years. So you could even have a situation where you find something that you think is maybe let's say, 3,400 years old, but in reality it's actually 3,200 years old, or maybe even older, because of the fact that the plus or minus, varies because of these regional overlaps. So you may find something that seems buried in one level, That level is simply, because of like different, activities or events that were happening that push it down to one level. And that's where the difficulty comes in, also even archaeologically. So let's look at this from a Torath Mosheh Israeli Jewish perspective, because I think one of the problems I've noticed is that this seems to be pushed to the side. People want to be able to say, well, the Israelites were like a Canaanite people, and I don't want to connect the Jews to, anything that's like realistic. I don't want to connect the Jews to the Israelites. I'm going to separate them somehow. And at the same time, even if I do connect the Jews to the Israelites, I want to say that, hey, all their stuff is incorrect. They don't know what they're talking about historically. I know better than them. But let's look at the Jewish perspective, because I think that if we take the Torath Mosheh perspective, you could see that the issue becomes a little bit even murkier, but even more clear on some level too at the same time. So the first thing, as I mentioned earlier, is this distinction of Israelite versus the words in Hebrew, in ancient Hebrew, of identifying the people that are modernly known as Jews or Israelis. The word in our language would have been Ivri, which is the actual word for, like people say Hebrew, and we'll explain this later, and Yisraeli. So Yisraeli, Ivri. So these are the things that we need to know from the language itself. Because Israelite, of course, is an Americanized, westernized English term. So the thing we have to understand here is if we look at a man by the name of Avraham ben Terach, he is basically the patriarch of the modern day and ancient Israeli, also Ivri people. Now, in English, people know him as Abraham, but his actual name and pronunciation in Hebrew is Avraham ben Terach. Ben Terach meaning son of Terach. Now, the thing that has to be noted here, this is from a section of the Torah in Bereshit. In English, you would call it Genesis. So it mentions that he came from Haran. So originally, he was from Ur Kasdim. He moved to Haran with his family. And then, according to our Jewish sources, when his father passed away, he left there and went to Canaan because Hashem told him that's where he would go. Now, the thing is, in the Torah, it says, "Weitzeu lelechet," and where this means like he left to go. And where was he leaving to go? Ratza Canaan. Okay, so he leaves in Haran and goes to Canaan. And basically it says Wahakanaani oz be'aretz. So the Canaanites were still in the land. So this brings up a question. During this time, Abraham's name would have been Avram bin Terach, because his name had been changed later. Does Avram bin Terach settling in the land of Canaan make him a Canaanite? Meaning, he moved from Haran, settles in Canaan, and he lived there for like a number of years until he died. Does it make him a Canaanite because he settled there? Well, again, the answer depends on what it means to be a Canaanite. We mentioned earlier that there's a lot of murky issues in terms of defining who exactly was a Canaani or a Canaanite, as well as what did the Canaanites say. So then the next step is Avraham's son, Yitzhak ben Avraham, Yitzhak, son of Avraham. He was actually born in Canaan, according to the Torah. Again, the Jewish Torah says that Yitzhak was born in Canaan. So this is, where the part is mentions about his birth, about him having a Brit Milah. So the next thing is that he was mainly raised in Beersheba, where it says Beersheba wa Yoshov Avraham be Beersheba. So, he was raised in Beersheba. He was raised in the area that would have been known by the Canaanim. So this brings up another question. Does Yitzhak ben Avraham, being born in the land of Canaan, make him a Canaanite? Again, the answer depends on what it means to be a Canaanite. We talked about the problems earlier of identifying who a Canaanite was, even outside of the Torah, even outside of Jewish culture. So if he was born in Canaan, does that make him a Canaanite? From an external point of view, maybe it does. Internally, did he consider himself a Canaani? No. According to the Torah and Jewish history, no. There's no text out there that says that he considered himself a Canaani and identified with being, but he grew up there. So, did the Canaanim have like ID cards? Did they give out citizenship when people were born there? Again, that's a question. The next step is Yaakov bin Yitzhak. This, which is, Yaakov bin Yitzhak, the Jacob in English, but of course his name was Yaakov, son of Yitzhak. So he was Yitzhak's son. He also was born in Canaan, according to the Torah, according to Jewish sources. So Yaakov says Yaakov Ishtam Yoshev Oholim. So he was settled, meaning, Yoshev Oholim has two meanings to it. One being that he was in the land of Canaan. He was settled there, but also he was learning Torah there, So he also, spent a lot of time in Beersheba, So this brings up the other question. Does Yaakov bin Yitzhak, being born in the land of Canaan, moving out of Canaan, then returning with his family to make him a Canaanite? Depends on what it means to be a Canaanite again. And then also, in the Torah explains that Yaakov, had many sons, and he and his sons moved back, to when he moved back, for example, to Canaan, that he settled in Shechem, which is it says Ir Shechem Asher Ba'aretz Canaan. So basically, in Canaan, they had settled in Shechem. So it identifies it as being Canaan. And it says Asher Netah Sham Oholo. So he settled himself there, established his level of Torah there, his teaching of Torah there, but also established himself physically in the land of Canaan. So then brings up the other question. Does Yaakov ben Yitzchak settling in Shechem after moving from Padan Aram make him Canaanites, him and his sons and his children? Does that make them Canaanites that they settled in Shechem? If it was in Canaan and the Torah identifies it being in Canaan, it depends on what it means to be a Canaanite. So you could externally look at it and say, yeah, the early Ivrim, which would have been Avraham, his son Yitzchak, his grandson Yaakov, and his great-grandchildren, all could be considered Canaanim, even based on the Torah's definition of it, especially if you're looking at it from an external point of view. Now, again, from their own point of view, they may have, according to the Torah, they looked at themselves and said, hey, we're in the land of Canaan, but we're not like the other people here. We're just simply settled here. But the Canaan is not, the culture is not our culture, which also, blends very well into what is, the scholars mention about Canaan not being like one systematic culture. And the Torah even says that there were different groups of Canaanim, that there wasn't one unified body of them. So again, using correct terminology, what most people in the West are used to is the English word Hebrew. I sometimes use the word, I kind of don't like it, but I mean, I don't have a choice because some people wouldn't understand what I'm talking about if I used Hebrew only. But the actual word in the actual language is Ivri, which you see in the middle of the slide at the top. And a correct transliteration of that word would be Ivri. In the Torah, of course, it says, La Avraham Ha'ivri. This is what you see in the red brackets. So Avraham was called Ha'ivri. He wasn't called the Hebrew, because that's an English term. I think it's based on maybe Greek, if I remember correctly, or Latin. But he was called Ha'ivri. So the meaning of that actual word, according to Jewish sources, is a descendant of Ever, also meaning coming from the other side, and also a location, location and different ideology, a designation of a specific ethnic group descended from Avraham bin Terach. So one of the things that some people have done in modern scholarship and Western scholarship is to try to identify the Ivrim with the Hyksos, or the Hekua Chasut, which are mentioned by Egyptian sources. And essentially, or some people say in the English, Habiru, or Apiru, according to a better transliteration. So this claim meaning is a combination of Egyptian and Akkadian meanings, meaning dusty or dirty, in a term used in 2nd millennium BC texts throughout the Fertile Crescent for people variously described as rebels, outlaws, raiders, mercenaries, bowmen, servants, slaves, and laborers. So essentially, if you were to talk to an Egyptian, they would probably not use the word Ivri in their own language. They would probably use something like Haku Hashuta, meaning that those those rebels, those dirty people, those outsiders, those outlaws. And they could have used this, during the time that they had contact with Avraham Ivri, or during, the time they had contact with, his grandchildren, with Yaakov, bin Yitzhak, or, the various leaders of the Jewish people who were in that area for a long time. So the terms they would have used, it's not like they had a history, look into the future and knew that one day that there would be people who would read a book by, a group of people known as Bnei Yisrael, or, Ivrim, and say, well, let's use the term that those people use to describe themselves. More than likely they would use their own term, the same way that we do in Hebrew. We have terms for countries and peoples that are not the exact words that those people use, simply because in our language, this is what we call them, and it means something to us, if we call them that. This would have been the same issue back then. So this is where you get into an issue where you may say Hyksos or Hibiru or Haku Hashut or Apiru may have been applied to a bunch of different people, where Ivri is very specific to the people who followed Avraham bin Terach, specifically the Torah or the Sheva Mitzvot of Noach, that he followed along with Brit Milah. So someone could have easily just used a blanket term to describe any group of people that seems to come from this one area in Canaan, and just simply say, okay, fine, they're Hakua Hashut, Hasut, or Apiru, for all of them, every single one of them. Doesn't matter which one. I don't need to differentiate on I don't have time, and they wouldn't have had internet, they wouldn't have had newspapers, so they wouldn't have figured out what all these variances. But it was just, okay, this is a blanket term for those people. So then the next thing is the correct pronunciation or transliteration of the following is not Israelite, meaning that the word Israelite is not our word. It's not a Jewish word. It's not an ancient word. Israelite is more of a modern word, and I've mentioned this in other videos. But if you look at the three most ancient references to the people who are known to keep Torah, keep Torath Mosheh. If you look in the Maranepta stela, it mentions them as being Yisraeli. And then if you look at the Mishnah stone, it spells it out, Yud, Shin, Resh, Aleph, Lamed. And if you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, same thing, Yud, Yud, Sin, Resh, Aleph, Lamed. So basically all of these sources are mentioning the same group of people who are known as Yisroel. So the pronunciation, according to the way it would have been pronounced in ancient times, is Yisroel, or in Samaritan pronunciation, Yishrael. So again, now we know we're talking about the people in this room, our ancestors, the ancestors of modern day Israelis and Jews, as being, the correct terminology is Yisroel, or the Samaritans would say Yishrael. And again, overlapping cultures, overlapping terminology. It would be easy to see why someone would think, okay, the Yisraelim or the Avrim must have been a Canaanite people because, again, our ancestors settled there at one point, stayed there for at least 3 generations to 4 generations, and then eventually, left, came back, and took over. And the overlap between that period of time of several hundred years, archaeologically speaking, it would take a lot of research to be able to see the differences between the two, especially when the cultures overlap with each other so closely. So now let's look at ancient depictions of ancient people in the region. So what you find in Egypt is a description of people who were in the land of Canaan. Again, no real distinction, between who's who. There's certain ways of dress that you may look and say, the one from the second to the right, for example, may have been Plishti, because of his headdress. But the other ones, for example, you could switch that out with almost anybody. And for example, this is one of the ways that ancient Jews were dressed, and we'll see in a moment why I say that. Okay, here this is from I think it's from a Babylonian relief where it's all actually specifically talking about the Yisraelim who were exiled in the area and who had been conquered. And I think it's from a stela they had where they were bringing tribute. So this one we clearly know where a particular group of Yisraelim. And this particular headpiece here was actually found here in Israel. And it's believed to be a king at one point. Now again, there's people going to probably argue about all kind of things on this. Just because of the color shows up the way it is right now doesn't mean several thousand years ago it didn't look differently. And even if it was the color of the person back then, who cares? It has no bearing whatsoever. The only thing that's important to a Torath Mosheh Jew is the Torah. Doesn't matter how anybody looks. So this is not one of those things where someone says, this is the way everybody looked 1,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago in this one area. No, they found this. That's what it is. Archaeology. The same thing when the Assyrians invaded and when they exiled people in a certain region of Israel, in Lachish, I think it is. This is what they carved. But again, this is up to their own methodology of carving, and this doesn't mean that every single person looked like this, but obviously this is what they carved. So if we want to take a look and compare that modern day Torath Mosheh Israelis and Jews, I'll be mainly looking at before or around the time of the state of Israel, when Jews from the Middle East, from the same regions we're talking about, came to this area or came back to the state of Israel, the land of Israel. So this is a group of Yemenite Jewish men who have a Torah in the middle. Again, the Torah being the focal point of all Israeli society. So you can see that the way that they're dressed, you can see that they are in this, from Yemen. Yemen, for example, had an interesting situation where they were not completely isolated, but had enough cultural isolation to have made a lot of traditions that were lost in other Jewish areas. Here you have a group of Habani Jewish men who have a Sefer Torah, a Torah scroll that, again, the central point of Am Yisrael. And you can see that the way they look and the way that they're dressed. Here you have a group of Habani Jewish women. Same kind of thing. You can look at different ancient pictures of people in the land of Canaan, the way that they're dressed, the way that they look, and you can see the basically cultural similarities there that have been maintained throughout Jewish cultures, for thousands of years. Here you have Moroccan Jewish women, same kind of issue. If you look at the way that they're dressed and look at the carvings that I showed earlier, you can see the connection there. And these are Kafkazi Jewish women. You can see the same thing there. And here's an Iraqi Jewish family, man, husband and I think his father and his daughters and his wife and his son. And also you have a Kurdi Jewish man and his family. And you can see the connections between all the people listed here. So beyond just pictures and beyond like ways of dress, the hallmarks of a Torath Mosheh culture is the Torah and the culture around the Torah, meaning that any one of these references here, you could, if someone was Jewish is looking at this, they would look at this and immediately know what all this is. They would know what every single thing in this picture is and what it relates to. Someone who's not Jewish may pick up on a couple of them, but may not understand the full context of all of them. So the thing is that's different here. If we were to try to say, okay, well, again, we want to make this comparison between the Canaanites and the Yisraelim. Well, one of the big differences is there's been thousands of years of Yisraeli text and culture, whether it be from the Dead Sea Scrolls, whether it be from different texts that have existed, with the Babylonian superscript, whether it be like scrolls that are from 1,300 years ago, whether it be Torah scrolls that exist today. You have a continuous transmission of information in a written form and in an oral form and in a cultural form amongst the Israeli people. And this would bring up the question, if the people of Israel were a Canaanite people, why did they survive and the Canaanites, the other Canaanites, if you will, did not? And that's a fair question. What made the Israeli culture so different and, that it lasted until the modern era where the ancient Canaanites don't exist today? You don't see anybody practicing ancient Canaanite. And even people in this region who claim to be Canaanite can't even read Canaanite and they don't have a Canaanite culture. So this leads to something I've been kind of, championing for like a long time, that when it comes to who in the modern day are the claimants of the ancient Israeli ancestry or culture, there's only three groups that are out there. Essentially, meaning that you have three groups that have a long, either like several hundreds or thousand year, like, tradition, and that's Torath Mosheh Jews, Karaites, and Samaritans. At some point, maybe I have to do maybe a video detailing more of the Karaites and Samaritans, but I think I've covered it in other videos. These are the only three groups who claim descendancy from Yisraelim who are at Mount Sinai. And this is again not just someone who like modernly jumped up and said within the last 100 years, this is what my ancestry is. We're talking about people who go back centuries through thousands of years, where you can find text in those communities written in the Hebrew language and in Aramaic. You can find the Torah, from several hundred years ago. You can find, like actual synagogues that exist, with all of this information we're talking about. You can find traditions, and also a culture, as well as a textual footprint, fingerprint that goes back thousands of years. And that's what I mean by that. So again, you've seen me mention this, time after time. When it comes to the Torah text itself, Torath Mosheh Jewish text, compared to a Samaritan text, you can actually take both texts and see where the cultural connections are and see where the separation between the two happen. This is something that you don't find as a continuous thing amongst the Canaanites. It's not clear at all where, who's what and what is what in many cases with the Canaanites. There's so many open holes and questions. Now, what's interesting is that Torah scrolls on both the Jewish side and the Samaritan side are always written without vowels. But yet this information has been passed down and taught to both Jewish children and Samaritan children on how to read such text. Where when it comes to the Western world, when they first got into contact with ancient Canaanite or Jewish text, they had to learn it from Jews and Samaritans how to read it because they didn't have it on their own. So it's important to also discuss when I say Torath Mosheh Jew. This is one of the things I hadn't done in a while, and I figured I had to do it at some point to kind of help people understand exactly when I say Torath Mosheh Jews, what am I talking about? What you see here is a list of pretty much everybody who can be considered a Torath Mosheh Jew, even if they don't use the term themselves directly in the way that I use it, for example, and other people use it. But generally speaking, this is what I'm talking about. All of these groups here are Torath Mosheh Jews, and it means the same thing to them that it means to me, that it means to anybody from all these different communities. And this is one of the ways that when you're dealing with any of these communities, you're dealing with someone who has an ancient Jewish tradition, an Israeli tradition that goes back thousands of years and can be traced back kind of like a fingerprint or footprint, back throughout time. And not just something somebody made up all of a sudden, like let's say a couple hundred years ago or even recently. So thus, when we talk about Torath Mosheh Jews, it's very clear at this point, it should be clear that what we're talking about is different than what the Canaanites were. Because again, the Canaanites don't exist. And also, depending on how you look at it, fine. At some point they were like Torah, the ancient Ephraim who were living, in the area of Canaan. And maybe you could have called them externally Canaanites. But culturally speaking, we existed and we continued, but they didn't for some reason. So in conclusion, we know now that when we talk about Yisrael and Canaan, we're not talking about the same people. We're talking about two distinct groups of people, which was, pretty clear based on the scholarly information about the Canaanim and, the fact that the Yisrael, the people of the Jewish people, the people of the Torah, still exist today, whether it be Israel, and we're definitely not Canaanim, but again, if you want to say anciently that our ancestors were in Canaan, settled in Canaan, were born in Canaan, then fine. At one point, they may have been Canaani, but now, after a point, they were not. So this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever. Thank you for listening. Take care, and bye.